All right, so I think we'll get started. I want to thank everybody for joining our third one of a series of these webinars for the CHAMP Network and CHAMP Center, Reducing Risk for Child Maltreatment and Treating Its Consequences, a national training series on application of causal science. This session, session 3, is about applying predictive and causal knowledge in practice. So of all of the webinars we're doing today, I think is going to focus the least on the data kind of science part of it and the most on how that translates into practice, with a lot of discussion of the practice piece. So the first one kind of laid out the basics. The second one, focused a little more on the causal knowledge piece. This one's going to focus a little more on practice. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's going to come next at the end of the webinar. So if you can move to the next slide, Glenn, that would be great.
Okay.
All right, just a couple housekeeping things before we get started. Again, my name is Andy Kleek, and I am Deputy Executive Director at NYU's McSilver Institute and working on this project. Okay, a couple things because we'll get these questions if we don't highlight it out loud. So the slides will be available after the webinar, and we're also recording this webinar, and it will be distributed as well. So everybody who registered for the webinar will get an email in the next couple days, one with the slides, and one webinar, but one with slides and the recording of the webinar. We encourage you to view that webinar afterwards if you want to get a little more information, want to go back and check on something or use the slides. But also feel free to share it with colleagues and friends and other people you think would find it more useful or would find it useful. And we're glad to get kind of that distributed that way as well. Again, I said this at the very beginning when we logged on. We did set this up as a Zoom meeting and not as a webinar, so folks can unmute themselves, and there'll be a couple times during the web presentation where Glenn is going to stop and ask for feedback from the audience. So feel free at that point to throw anything you have into the chat, or just raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can ask your question or give your comment that way. Also, just to highlight that we are keeping track of all the questions that go into the chat over the course of the webinar. And so you can put questions in the chat at any time, and either we'll address them in an appropriate pause, or we'll wait to the end. We'll take questions and keep track of those. So for me, if I have a question at a particular moment, I oftentimes forget it. So good to put it in the chat when you have it rather than wait. So I think with that, if we go to the next slide, this webinar is backed up by a series of faculty associated with both the CHAMP Network and the CHAMP Center. You can read that on your own. We're not going to go around and introduce everybody, but just to highlight that there's a whole group of folks, some of whom are on today and some of whom aren't, who really back up this whole center. So with that, I'm going to pass this on to Dr. Sachs, who is going to lead us through the webinar today.
Thanks, Andy. So welcome back, everyone. This is session 3, as Andy was saying, applying predictive and causal knowledge in practice. This will be the most clinical of all the sessions that we have. And part of this, as we've talked about before, is to set the framework of why predictive and causal data science is needed. The idea is, what do we need to change outcomes for people? And that sets the requirement for science. So all of this is to focus on what's needed and how science can have value for what's needed. So the goal of today's session is to review concepts that we talked about before. We want to then apply predictive and causal knowledge to help Eddie, which is the case that we talked about last time, where we looked at conventionally how we would be helping Eddie and why an alternative frame is necessary. And in today's session, I'll be reviewing that alternative frame. I'll do that by introducing trauma systems therapy. That is a treatment model that I created with my team many years ago as an example of intervention based on the application of predictive and causal knowledge. This is an example to show you how it could be done, but it could be done in many, many different ways. And with that, all of this is for you to consider how to apply predictive and causal knowledge for cases you work with. And if you're a scientist, to think about how what you're discovering could inform the care of kids and families. And with that, it's about looking at, well, what are the gaps in science necessary to improve this knowledge? We can't think of gaps in science without thinking of the utility of the knowledge that we need to disseminate. So here is some disclosures of support I get. And so let's just review some key concepts. Not everyone was at the previous session, so I just want to briefly catch people up. And this could be a quick review for people who've been here before. So again, we're focused on child maltreatment outcomes. This is any deleterious event or events undermining safety, development, etc., related to maltreatment exposure, the consequences, and we could think of outcomes related to exposures to maltreatment or the consequences of it. And then care, working with people, is all about two things, and essentially only two things. Is the person in front of me at risk for a bad maltreatment outcome? If so, what can I do to reduce the risk? 1 and 2. Everything goes there. We reviewed key definitions, so we're all on the same page. I'm not going to go over details right now. The essential thing here about distinguishing predictive knowledge and causal knowledge is, with causal knowledge and outcome B, say, is the value of B is dependent on the value of A, and this therefore has massive treatment implications, because then if I change A, I would expect B could change. And we reviewed why predictive knowledge isn't also necessarily causal. We talked about common causes. Lung cancer is correlated with yellow fingers, but confounded by smoking. We went through that, and that brought us to this statement that you should burn in your brain. If it's green, you can intervene. If it's red, get that out of your head. We reviewed this before because red here is factors that are confounded, and especially with outcomes of complex etiology where there's multiple causes, there could be a lot of confounding if we're not using the right methods, and then we would be intervening all we want and it will never change the outcome. If it's green, you can intervene. If it's red, no. And that led us to talk about this makes things very personalized, because we could then assess the causal factors contributing to someone's risk and intervene specifically for kids based on their vulnerabilities. Causal knowledge and multi-causality equals personalized, precise intervention. And that brought us to something that I'm going to expand a lot today, where prediction under intervention condition is really what's required for effective care. We have to make accurate predictions about the response to interventions, and then especially learn from those results. And just to review here, we gather the clinical data, we then understand, we predict outcomes under intervention conditions, we intervene, we measure outcome results, we compare the results to what we predicted, and that leads to us to refine understanding. So when you're in this framework, you're learning, and we need to learn to get it right. So I'm going to remind everyone about Eddie because we talked a lot about Eddie's care last time, and I'm going to continue with Eddie's care, showing you an alternative way to help him. So if you recall, Eddie's an 8-year-old boy. He'd repeated episodes of hitting, kicking, biting other kids and adults. And most recently, he ran at his teacher, knocking her off her stool. He had a history of physical abuse from his father and came to assessment with mother because of concern about episodes pushing teacher off her stool. There's an episode of kicking his soccer coach, another episode of biting another child at recess at school, and then other data showed symptoms of may have been PTSD or ADHD. And so the clinician there diagnosed him with comorbid PTSD and ADD and intervened in 2 ways with trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy and methylphenidate, with the prediction, the expectation that the aggressive episodes would reduce.
Dr. Sachs, I have a question, sir.
Sure.
After we review Eddie's profile, would you mind going over one more time how we identify the red confounding variables?
Well, that's when we go through this, I think it'll be clear to you. So why
Okay,
don't we wait on that one? Because
sounds good.
in essence, what we're trying to do here is figure out what causes the aggression clinically and ways of doing that here. So
Okay, sounds good.
sure. And so what happened was that the understanding was not sufficient because he was seen 2 weeks later. Maybe he was a bit less hyperactive and inattentive, but 2 significant aggressive episodes in the schoolyard with the same kids. He kicked another kid, the monitor report, without provocation. There was another episode at lunchtime where the monitor at cafeteria said, without provocation, he stood up, he shoved his tray at her, and the drink fell over, staining her clothes. And then anxiety nightmares were unchanged. So, this is prediction error, right? Treatment was implemented with the expectation things would get better. 2 weeks later, things weren't better, maybe worse. You can always say, let's give it more time, of course. You always need to consider that, but you also should consider that maybe your intervention did not target the causal factors contributing to the aggression. And so how do you determine that? So now let's talk about, now we're moving into today's session. How do we apply predictive causal knowledge to help Eddie, to help other kids in your practice, if you are in practice, or in any practice? So let's first start with just basic stuff. Why do traumatized, maltreated kids typically present for care? Usually they present because they repeatedly express episodes of uncontrolled emotion behavior that the child or someone else recognizes as problematic. Clearly, we see that for Eddie. And here's just some examples. That's Eddie. Here's Brianna, 15-year-old girl, repeatedly cuts her arms and says she wants to die. Marcus, 17-year-old boy, multiple episodes running away from foster home, misses school, returns home intoxicated, risk for losing foster placement, repeating the year at school. Leah, 12-year-old girl, at times seems in her own world, fully disengaged from what's going on around her at home and at school. if you work clinically in this field, sadly, tragically, these are the kids we see. So how do we orient our care to diminish their risk for these outcomes, these repetitive episodes? So the central question in causation is why. This is The Book of Why by Judea Pearl, who has some of his basic ideas founded causal data science. But the question of why is the causal question that we're always asking. It works in science, it works clinically. When you're in the causal world, it's all about why. So why does Eddie hit, kick, bite other kids and adults? Why does Brianna cut her arms and say that she wants to die? Why does Marcus run away from his foster home, miss school, and return home intoxicated? Why does Leah seem in her own world and gets fully engaged from what's going on around her? Why? Because when we answer why correctly, it leads to a focus of treatment with plausibility of helping. But how do you get to why? So, as I was just saying, and this just reviews what I've said before, puts it all together. When we intervene, we predict that patients' risk will be less for the prognostic outcome that we worry about. The only way our predictions can be accurate if intervention successfully targets a cause of that outcome. Therefore, we improve our chance of success with knowledge of the causes of the prognostic outcomes we worry about. And this is most important. By doing it in this way, we learn to improve our chances of success over time as we receive evidence of the accuracy of our prediction or prediction errors. So people are complex. It's hard to get it right when we embark on treatment. There's so many factors, but if we're prepped to be always learning, always understanding, predicting, intervening, gathering evidence and prediction, updating our understanding and our approach to treatment, we will get it right over time. So I'm going to show you now, this is an approach, the trauma systems therapy approach. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that my treatment is what you should do for everything. But what I am saying is I want you, because most approaches in mental health don't really have such a focus on finding causal factors and intervening on them. And so I'm giving this as an example, but other approaches could be used, but approaches should really focus on these sorts of things. So just some background on what trauma systems therapy is. It was, developed a while ago. Our last book was almost 10 years ago that I wrote with Heidi Ellis and Adam Brown. And so it's a treatment model for traumatized kids and their families. We've been disseminating it since about 2003. It's now in about 17 states, 4 different countries. It's been widely adapted, mental health, child welfare, refugee programs, schools, lots of different places. It's always implemented by a multidisciplinary team trained to deliver TST with fidelity. And it is a defined causal framework and uses prediction to guide the work. I know several people in the audience right now are using trauma systems therapy. So, I'm curious about your response to all of this, and you could be a good resource in the discussion about some of the applications I'll be talking about. I think Adam may be in the room also, who, again, he's one of the developers of TST. So a few other things about TST just to get you oriented. So it has a perspective on traumatic stress. It's not PTSD. It's kind of a way we thought would be much more clinically informative. Traumatic stress occurs when a child is unable to regulate emotional states and in certain moments experience his or her current environment is extremely threatening, even when it is relatively safe. And then this definition of traumatic stress leads to talking about episodes that are repeated, moments that involve what we call survival state expression, defined as a characteristic pattern of maladaptive thoughts, emotions, behaviors expressed by a traumatized child resulting from their perception of threat in specific contexts where the child is not under objective threat. And this leads to the way clinical problems are always defined within TST, which are called survival state problems, which are the predictable pattern of a traumatized child's survival state expression in response to particular contextual stimuli on occasions when the child is not under objective threat. So we're looking for those particular stimuli, and we're looking for the child's ability to regulate in the face of them. And we adapted a causal theory of traumatic stress, which is all based on contextual processing. This came from Israel Lieberzon and James Adolescent's work, context processing neurobiology of post-traumatic stress disorder, where essentially they talk about different brain circuits for emotional regulation, fear learning, and exaggerated threat detection, involving executive function and emotional regulation, the amygdala, the salience network, and we put it together here for TST, where you have survival state expression and trauma, you have a developing contextual processing nervous system with fear learning, emotional regulation, and threat detection, with connections that look like this. And of course, it's not only about what's going on inside of the child, it involves their exposure to threat signals in the present, and of course, who's around the child, especially caregivers who are involved in modulating threat signals, hopefully helping with fear learning, threat detection, emotional regulation. And then this leads to interventions about diminishing threat signals, building caregivers' capacities, building the child's emotional regulation capacity, extinguishing fear learning, and occasionally with psychotropic medication that could really help the management of emotion. So again, it's a causal theory adapted by the literature. And, obviously this isn't a full TST training. I'm just giving you enough to understand some basic things about how predictive and causal knowledge is used clinically. So I'll just say something massively important about context and contextual conditions. So in TST, these contextual conditions, the threat signals are everything because your knowledge about them allows you to intervene by decreasing the kid's exposure to the contextual conditions that drive the survival states. And knowing those conditions allows you to help a child to tolerate their exposure to this without expressing survival states, which massively helps. I want to introduce context too with a really important experiment that I'm probably the biggest popularizer of Panksepp's great experiment with playing rats. I know people who've been trained in TST know this like in their bones at this point, but I want everyone to know about this experiment because it's incredibly clinically useful. So Panksepp is, the father of affective neuroscience. It's what his textbook is called. It's the emotion and the brain. And he believes, believe it or not, play is a basic substrate of the emotion of joy. We all know joy is very important if we're thinking about kids. And we know when play goes wrong, it stops, something big is happening. So Panksepp says all young mammals play. It's part of the evolution of joy. That's what he talks about. And he does a very interesting experiment where he quantifies play over a 10-day trial. The first 4 days, rats are happily playing, and then he introduces a minimal fear stimulus, a single hair from a cat. These are lab rats. They've never been exposed to a cat before, but drops the hair in the cage for 24 hours, play stops, takes it out. Life is never the same again. They don't play anymore. And why do I tell you this? Obviously, my TST friends know this very well, but the kids we work with live in cages full of cat hair, and sometimes they live with the cat. And so these threat signals are critically important to understand and help with. So if we think about Eddie, for example, he's been physically abused by his father. Might there be threat signals, minimal threat signals driving survival states? We have to understand that. So we have to assess details about the episodes to know. And so what do we assess? We have to get some detail here. So I'm going to talk to you about what we call the 4 R's and 3 A's. So regulating, this is to introduce you to the way of assessing these episodes to know. Regulating, it's before any escalation happens. It's when a kid is at their baseline. Affect, awareness, and action are the 3 A's. What was the child feeling? What were they aware of? What were they thinking of? What were they doing before any dysregulation happened? Okay, we have to know that. Then revving is when the regulation was just beginning. With dysregulation, was just beginning, just starting. Things are escalating. What was the child feeling? What were they thinking about? Awareness, what were they doing? Re-experiencing, now it's at its worst. Think of Eddie and him punching, him, kicking, all of that. What was he thinking? What was he feeling? What was he doing? And then reconstituting, it's when things are just calming down. Again, what was he feeling? What was he aware of? What was he doing? And so people are trained in order to do that, to assess each of these R's and the 3 A's. And between regulating and revving is where cat hair comes in. We want to notice the slight change, with a little, it could be a very minor stimuli, leads to a process of dysregulation and survival states. And so here is how we operationalize a survival state, is a shift in the 3 A's across the 4 R's elicited by a signal that was perceived by the child consciously or unconsciously as threatening. And we help people assess this. Here's a moment-by-moment assessment where people are trained to assess people very meticulously in this process of dysregulation. So you could really get to see each episode and then put it together in terms of patterns. So now I'm going to give you a little more detail about episodes. So the episode about the teacher pushing her off her stool, Eddie ran at her immediately following his teacher handing him his spelling test graded unsatisfactory, while she commented with a critical tone of voice, "Eddie, you're just not making the effort needed in this class." The episode about kicking his soccer coach, he kicked the coach after the coach put another child, Jerry, in Eddie's position on the soccer team, explained to Eddie, because Jerry tries harder than you in practice. And the third one, Eddie bit another kid at recess during competition of several kids on the monkey bars, the playground. That was difficult for Eddie. And the other kid laughed at Eddie loudly, explained to other kids, "See, Eddie can't do it no matter how hard he tries." So why? Does anyone see any pattern between these episodes? If you're someone who does TST, don't ask first. So you could either put it in the chat or raise your hand or say, anyone see any pattern here that might explain something about why? Okay. Quinta?
Looks like it's a pattern of moments when he is deemed incompetent.
Deemed incompetent. Okay.
Mhm.
So that's something we could see there, that, and so he may be very vulnerable to that. Part of it is looking and seeing it, and when a team struggles with this, to see what exactly is it. And it might be he's criticized for his competence. Does anyone else see something?
So Mendy put in the chat, anytime he feels inadequate or not good enough. Claire added, Eddie feeling put down for his efforts or standing out in a negative way. And then Megan added perceived criticism.
Yeah. Okay. So, and again, this is what we struggle with. We look, because in almost every case, these episodes are not random. And so the question is, how could we gather data that might tell us the non-randomness about it? So people are talking about criticism, people are talking about effort, all of that. One of the things, one of the things that we saw looking at this is, it seemed there was something about effort here where Eddie seemed to be trying, that seemed to be a trigger. Part of it is, you might put this together and think of criticism, effort, but then you're in a position to check it out based on what happens. You'll make predictions based on it. So let's see how I might put these comments together in terms of a definition of a survival state problem, which becomes the clinical problem in TST. Again, the definition in general, the repetitive expression of child's characteristic pattern of survival states in response to particular contextual stimuli when the child is not under objective threat. So the way we saw this is Eddie repetitively expresses out of control aggression, including hitting, kicking, pushing, biting peers and adults, when he feels they've criticized his effort for something he's tried hard to achieve. I think many of your comments kind of pulled that out. And so we really thought this was it. One of the things we do, and I'm not going to talk much about this, is once you have a survival state problem, we do what we call trauma inference. We try and infer what this can tell us about his vulnerability based on his trauma history. And in fact, Eddie was physically abused by his father when his father believed he wasn't making enough effort for something because his father had a belief that a man makes effort, a man throws himself in, tries, and so it became a real issue for Eddie and helped us see why he may be so vulnerable. And so this has huge, huge, huge predictive value. So if you have a survival state problem, then you could predict that whenever Eddie is exposed to contexts where he's criticized for his effort, he'll become aggressive. Then you would expect if you intervene in that, he'll be less at risk for getting aggressive. And so this becomes a means of testing your ideas here, because in the future episode, evidence of future aggressive episodes in this same context of criticism for effort supports our understanding, but we're always open to being wrong. So evidence of future aggressive episodes in other contexts when he's not criticized for his effort should make us question whether we got it right, whether we need to refine it to something more precise or we've missed something. And also evidence that he didn't get aggressive in the context where he's criticized for his effort also should make us question. So when we have a survival state problem, it allows us to predict and over time refine our understanding based on what happens. Now, then we might think about, we heard about 2 other episodes, right? So how might you know if these were consistent with our understanding of survival states? What might you do to know? Anyone? Okay, you could do something like a moment-by-moment assessment where you gather information, like I said, whether you're doing TST or not, it's getting clinical data. So I'm going to focus on that episode where the school monitor, in the cafeteria, reported he, without provocation, stood up and pushed his lunch tray at her, and the drink spilled, etc. So to her, it seemed very spontaneous and unprovoked, but let's see. So if you're assessing Eddie, you might ask, before this happened, before you got upset, what was going on? So he was in the cafeteria. He said he's eating his Jell-O. He's feeling happy. What's he's thinking? What was he thinking about? He's not sure, but when you ask, I was thinking about the new Marvel movie. I'm very excited about seeing it. He's in the cafeteria. Then lunch is in, his monitor is putting some pressure on him to clean up, finish his Jello. So his action, rushing to finish, he's anxious. I'm thinking she's mad at me. I said, I'm trying. And the monitor said, well, not hard enough. And with that, stood up, shoved the lunch tray, angry, and he said, I don't remember even doing it. And lunch tray struck, monitor, got in a lot of trouble. And then he's trying to calm down, sitting outside the vice principal's office. He's worried, he's thinking I'm in big trouble, all of that. So you could see here that this is massively important to know, right? This gives you so much information. And you could see, actually, when you get this data, it's consistent with your understanding. He's trying to clean up, and she says, well, you're not trying hard enough, that sort of thing. And so we know the trigger, and it's one of these things where it may not be so clear. You may not be 100% sure because the data is a little messy, all of that, but this just sets you up to know over time. So, you'll refine your knowledge based on predictions, as I was saying before. But the important thing is this then sets you up to intervene effectively. So, any thoughts on what we would then do? What would you do given your knowledge now? How would that adjust? How would that guide your intervention approach? Any ideas? Anyone, even my TST friends, anyone, what
And you
are,
can either raise your hand or throw it in the chat, either way.
someone.
This is Quinta. I would educate the members of his caregiving system, like guardians or maybe school, whoever is involved in this child's life, just informing them of the evidence that I have, to see if we can work together to come up with a plan to help with his regulation.
Yeah.
So I would focus on psychoeducation at first.
And that's great. And so what would you ask them to do? The people you're talking to help Eddie?
I would ask them just to observe him for a little bit, just to maybe test my hypotheses of what I believe revs him or gets him to escalate. Just
Okay.
just let him know, hey, watch for this and see what happens.
Yep.
Just
Yep.
data collection mainly, and then we can proceed from there.
Okay, it's good. Any other people have ideas?
So I got a couple things in the chat. Claire jumped in with two things. She said she's a student, so not as experienced as a clinician, but she was a teacher. So she thinks that this approach would be more helpful. And then also said that it helps people around him to be vigilant and proactive. And then Beverly highlighted that helping Eddie with the concept of asking for help, to give him some agency in this. And then Beverly jumped in and said, team, to acknowledge his effort, to get the team to acknowledge his effort and work on allowing that we all make mistakes as we learn. Yeah. So to acknowledge and give him praise for the effort that he's making.
Okay. No, these are great comments. People sound like TST therapists there. That's great. So here's some things that can, ask Eddie's mother, teacher, school monitors, coach to recognize Eddie for his effort proactively. So if he's feeling recognized, he's less for effort, he's less likely to be vulnerable to this. ask Eddie's mother, teacher, school monitor's coach to never criticize him for his effort. I mean, we could work with him, but we know that is Eddie's cat hair. You know, that those signals could be many, but that's what's going to lead to the problem. But, you know, in the bounds of reality, we're never going to protect Eddie, or should we, from ever hearing criticism about his effort. So as we're working with him, we want to build his emotional regulation skills and capacities in the context of someone criticizing him for his effort. So when he gets that criticism, he's not going to get aggressive like that. We might, in the short term, consider psychotropic medication to help him manage emotion until his emotional regulation capacities are improved. And once he's better able to regulate emotion for such criticism, we would introduce trauma processing, physical abuse from his father, and that's means of extinguishing fear learning, as I was talking about before. So this would be the nuts and bolts of a treatment plan for Eddie. Now, we also, in TST, we variably introduce this, but we're really going all in for this. And recently, it's let's formalize predictions so that we could check and see over time. And so basically before treatment, just before you're supposed to start treatment, you look back in the previous 4 weeks and say, how often did a child have a survival state? What's the frequency on, you see this 5-point scale? And then we have another 5-point scale on the degree to which it impaired their psychosocial functioning. And I could give you details on the scale if anyone wants, but it's a 5-point scale from severe impairment to no impairment. And then you're about to start treatment. Let's make a prediction of, in 4 weeks after treatment starts, how much better do you think it's going to be? And then in 4 weeks, we'll check. So for Eddie, he was having these survival states at least once per week. There was serious impairment. He was at risk for losing his school placement. And then you predicted in 4 weeks, if we do the treatment I've just said, it'll be a number 2 at least once every other week, and there would be some improvement on impairment. Now, 4 weeks later, you look at what happened, and actually there wasn't a change. And you know, you're going to predict for the next 4 weeks. So every 4 weeks we predict. So now you're in a position, well, you thought you had it right, but you didn't, because he wasn't getting better as you expected. So this allows you to review what you might have missed, because learning is always important here. It's pivotal. So was there a causal misunderstanding? Was the survival state problem the right one? Was the treatment approach? We have different phases of treatment in TST. I didn't go through, but was he in the wrong phase? Was treatment implemented without sufficient fidelity to the model? If everything, everything was correct, the causal understanding was right, was there the right engagement we needed in treatment? We have to check that. And then finally, we go through this sequentially. Did something new happen that was not anticipated or addressed in treatment? So this is a way of updating our knowledge based on prediction under intervention conditions. So what I'm going to do now, again, most of you aren't trained in TST, but this is just, you could do this, implement these ideas for any kids you're working with. And I'll just put here a number of principles to allow you to predict under intervention conditions in order to make your care over time more and more and more effective. And again, it's implementing this model here. So here's some principles for you. Define clearly the episodes you're working with, bringing the child and family to care. These are your outcomes. Define them clearly. Think of the kids you're working. Think right now, you should think of any kid you're working with and think of the episodes. I'm sure you're already doing that, but I want you to be as specific as possible. Think about their frequency and the level of functional impairment they entail. Then, again, assess the details of their occurrence related to the context in which they occur and the child's strengths and vulnerabilities in those very contexts, because you're going to need to help the child build their strengths and also reduce those contextual conditions. Work with people in their environment to manage them. Formulate the clinical problems according to the patterns you observe, making the expression of the episodes more or less likely. This is your working hypothesis about why. Clinical care is all about working hypotheses that you get better and better and better by using evidence to test your understanding. Develop an intervention strategy to target those causal factors contributing to why you believe the child expresses these episodes. Then you're in a position to make your predictions. You don't need TST to make predictions. This is just basic stuff. Make your predictions. You've already defined how often it happens and how bad it was. So let's think forward the next month. What do you expect to observe? Then intervene. Then at regular interviews, TST is designed, I know, for monthly, whatever intervals you think are relevant, but check, were you accurate? And then review or refine your strategy for intervention based on those results. Now, then consider gaps in your knowledge that would improve predictive accuracy. Now we're getting into what you need from our science, how the literature could help you, what's available. So search the literature for anything that might help you. Is there another intervention out there that you think than the one you're using? Or is there a better way of assessing? What does the literature show you? And if you can't find anything, right now, and it's a big part of this whole training series, is the alignment between science and practice. So if our science isn't giving us what we need, that's its purpose. It's there to serve practice. We need to advocate with our professional organizations. We need to know. And I'll just give you examples of, what would be for TST, what would I want to know from science? And I wish I had better information. We classify kids based on moment-by-moment assessments, survival state problems. Is there a better way of doing this? I think we're doing well, but is there a better way? Or are there other causes that we may be targeting that would, or to tell us which kids would most respond to which treatments? For example, is there, there isn't, but I would want there to be a way genes or anything else might help me. The best way, are there better treatments, more potent ways of targeting the causes we're targeting? And measurement, are there better ways of measuring things than we're using? I use this as an example of like to show you we want to search the literature. We want to demand from the literature things that are going to help. And as we move forward in the training series, we're going to be moving more to the science and how to improve the science. But again, the point of this is the purpose of science is to serve practice. And so I wanted to frame this in terms of what does our practice need. I want to say if anyone wants more information about either trauma systems therapy, to get trained in it, work with bring it to your agency, or we have for people who don't need full TST or want full TST, we have an animated series called the Never Look Away Trauma Training Program that gives you a lot of information about this. And so the QR code there, you should scan it to the Trauma Systems Therapy Training Center, and it gives you more information about how to get more about the clinical approach I talked about. And so looking towards next session, it's going to be about, well, what are the gaps in knowledge to help prediction? We're going to look at in methods for causal discovery, diagnostic classification, the interventions that are available to us, limitations in clinical trials. So we're moving more now in our series into the science. And I think that's it for what I have to talk about.
All right, thanks, Glenn. So I would encourage people to raise their hand if they have questions they want to ask out loud, or they're welcome to throw questions or comments into the chat while they do that. As you're doing that, while we're waiting for that to come through, Jenna is going to throw the evaluation into the chat. So we would encourage everybody to fill out the evaluation. It's a pretty quick and straightforward thing.
Did I stop the share, Andy?
No, it's still there.
But should I stop it?
If you want to, sure.
Okay.
So the feedback survey is in the chat. So please complete that. And then I would encourage folks to either throw questions into the chat or raise your hand if you have questions.
Must be something. Questions, comments. I love arguments too. Debate.
So Glenn, one question that's, if we're not seeing questions right now, one thing that's come up is just how you, when you get to causal factors, start to think about adapting your clinical treatment to address those causal factors. And I know you talked about that a little bit today, but I just wanted to just highlight that and see if you could give some comments on that.
Yeah. So, you know, what I'm talking about is like, given the state of the knowledge, you're using your clinical skill to find causal factors. And, you know, like the model I showed you, a causal factor could be, you know, a threat signal. It could be a kid's emotional regulation capacity. But really, and what we're doing here is we're classifying kids based on those causal factors. You know, are they such that you could classify them into a category of having a survival state problem and what that is? And so, but anything, let's say in the literature, shows you a gene that might help your classification, refine it, make it better, that sort of thing is then clinically relevant. So maybe there's a finding on a gene that shows you a subcategory of kids that are going to be more responsive to this intervention or less responsive. It's that sort of thing. Or maybe there's a demographic or social factor that allows you to be more refined in knowing who's going to respond to what element of intervention. So this is moving forward. It's all about how you would use knowledge from the literature that would be relevant in order to help you know how to best intervene.
Got it. And we had a question from Beverly in the chat. How would you compare trauma systems therapy to something like MST?
Yeah. So it's interesting. We ended up way back. TST was first and began as an adaptation of MST because it was at the time MST was the only explicitly social ecological model around. So this is in the late 90s actually. But the difference was there wasn't enough specificity about what drove the traumatic stress problems. It was definitely social ecological, but it wasn't precise or specific enough about the drivers, about why a kid was behaving in the way they were, feeling the way they were. So we needed to adapt it and then made it completely different for these reasons.
Got it. Quinta, you raised your hand.
Hi, Dr. Sachs. Thank you for this class. It was very informative, and I think it's headed in the direction of what we're greatly missing in modern psychology, which is the whole idea of causation and predictability, I think, is huge. The APA has a definition of mental health as one that is, I think you referred to it in the last session as a pathology type model, where if we don't see any pathological symptoms, then a person is mentally healthy. And I struggle with that because even if a child isn't acting out, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is okay. And so I wonder if maybe we need to go all the way back to the drawing board to say, what is a healthy mindset? Like if a mind is working the way it's supposed to work, what does that look like?
Yeah.
Because if we don't have that, then it's difficult to say that a mind is, well, if we have that, then when things have gone awry, it might make it easier for us to determine, okay, what in that process is being interfered with in what way?
Yeah. You know, it's a terrific question. It's really important because it's exactly like you're saying, Quinta. I mean, mental health should not just be defined as an absence of mental disorder for sure. And I don't want to represent TST as a way of like managing that because we haven't developed it in such a robust way as I think it should. However, you know, we in the last phase of TST called Beyond Trauma, we integrate certain things related to what I think is really important to mental health. One of them is meaning making, looking at kind of what gives a person meaning, what gives a parent meaning, a child meaning, all of that. And it helps them think about both meaning out of their traumatic experience and their work and treatment, but what do they most care about, want out of life? How could they? Because I think mental health is, you know, a lot of people have talked about it. I don't have like a best definition, but I think meaning is an important part of that. And at least in that respect, we've integrated that within TST.
And Chris, I saw you had your hand
See,
raised.
my friend Chris is here with his hand. That's great. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Glenn. I should just disclose that Glenn and I go back a long way. We're old friends. We've had many and interesting conversations at NCTSN meetings. I have two questions for you. The first one is a little more perhaps speculative, but in our clinic, for example, we're partnering with OQ Systems Outcome Questionnaire to adopt routine monitoring and clinical monitoring and feedback systems. And it seems to me, based on the case study, that at least some of what you're doing, your targeted outcomes, might be amenable to instruments that have been specifically developed to be maximally sensitive to clinical change. Not just simply validated with criterion reference validity, but validated so that they change maximally per exposure to an effective treatment. And so I'm interested in your thoughts about how that interfaces this kind of a methodology approach interfaces with that, because it seems also that you're going to be creating idiosyncratic measures, for example, like is he exposed to social humiliation, degradation, for example, and mocking when he doesn't try hard enough or when he tries and still fails. So you're going to be creating sort of idiosyncratic measures that way, but then you also have perhaps other types of instrumentation that is standardized and actually is plugged into that kind of methodology, that goes back a good 30 years. If you want to answer that question first, that's fine.
Oh, no, it's a great question. I remember some of our discussions in this way too. So the best of an instrument that captures change, that captures any outcome that you care about in, as reliably and validly as you can is great. The one thing it leaves out, though, is what will you do with the information to make things better when you're applying it to someone? And whether you're doing it formally or not, the reason you would use that information to change anything is because the results were other than you expected. And so it's all about prediction then. So I'd say with a prediction approach like this, use the best instrumentation you can. But if you want to formalize it in terms of its clinical utility, formalize the predictive aspect of it, because whether you do that or not, that's the only way it's going to become clinically relevant.
Okay. All right. That's something to think about. A second one, let's say, for example, you've got a well-articulated model that's populated with multiple green arrows, but the size of the arrows is commensurate, if you will, with the causal potency of the factor. And some of them, if you will, are minor kind of tweaks and others are major. And I think about this as somebody who just developed a program for Bosnian adolescents where our resources were very scarce. And let's say, for example, we had overworked Bosnian school counselors who'd say, listen, we only have so much time. What we can do three things. And frankly, maybe you can do one expensive thing that generates the most causal ROI, but maybe there's some minor tweaks that collectively can have a commensurate effect that can be equally potent. Does your methodology provide some guidelines about whether tweaking multiple things, for example, that may have more minor causal potency, but that are more, accessible, more efficient, more convenient, et cetera, versus doing something else like, a home-based visit, for instance, could be quite expensive, takes a lot of time, et cetera, relationship building, versus a set of tweaks, for example, at school. Yeah. So how do you think through that if you only have a limited number of resources?
Yeah. So as usual, you ask great questions, Chris. So we are deeply in the trenches on exactly these issues. I mean, the first thing is we have to know the size of the effect to weigh in on that. And we have to know the size of an effect for several causes that may accumulate to an effect that has for the same sort of intervention. So you need to know that in an unconfounded way. But then domain expertise is always really important for the reasons you've said. So then you consider the trade-offs. Is there an intervention available that's, cost, effective and efficient enough for where you are? Can it be used in the real world? How does it work within the service system? All of that. So, but the way I think about it is that first you need to know kind of what are the facts. Okay, are there a set of causes that which have varying degrees of effect that and you have unbiased or limited biased estimates of effects, so that then you could start wrestling with those trade-offs. The way we do it in the Champ Center, as we're designed to do it, is that we create decision support tools based on causal models. But to create those decision support tools, we have teams of experts who sit and wrestle with exactly what you're talking about, so that those things could be programmed within the tool.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, there are weighty issues, and too often we just sort of say, well, we'll leave that to clinician discretion or clinician judgment, when in fact, if the models themselves can support that, we find that relieves the clinician of a burden, because otherwise it feels sometimes quite arbitrary when they have to make painful decisions about who gets what types of resources.
Yeah, no, it's exactly that. I mean, the science has to serve the clinic, so to speak, right? And so we have to create the knowledge and tools to help. And some of it is going to be entirely computational, and some of it will be taking the computational results with the domain expertise to come up with something that's practical for the field.
Yeah. Great, thank you.